very much, Juliet, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Juliet mentioned, this is a joint event between Neurodiversity and IRMA, and I'm really grateful to IRMA for letting us do this and organising it as a new SG. It's one of the really helpful ways of getting the message out there. So yeah, there are some really, really good reasons, including legal ones, to collect and report upon equity, diversity, and inclusion data on employees and within organizations. However, doing this can put the very people the work is intended to help at quite significant risk. So I'm Matthew Bowringer, as we've mentioned, and today I'm going to talk about neurodiversity, why organizations collect data on it, what can go wrong with that, and how we can do it better. So I'll talk a little bit more about neurodiversity at the end of this presentation. This talk is based on a paper published last year in the Journal of Data Protection and Privacy. Whilst I'm speaking, please do ask questions in the chat, and I'll try and bring them in if I can. Otherwise, there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end. This talk is going to be around 45 minutes long. There'll be a couple of opportunities for reflection where you might want to take notes. So if you want to have something for that handy, please do. What I'd like to do is start by briefly exploring what I mean by neurodiversity, its benefits, and why organizations in particular can struggle with it. So neurodiversity is really a simple fact of anatomy. It's the variance in different neurology amongst all people, which leads to differences in thinking, feeling, and experiencing of the world. So in a sense, everyone is neurodiverse. However, some people differ from the kind of social expectations, the standard way we think about how people are supposed to think, feel, and experience the world, and are marginalized because of it. Some of these ways are associated with specific conditions and diagnoses. For example, Tourette's, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, or autism. And I will use the word neurodivergent to refer to people whose neurology differs from these expected ways, whether that's associated with a specific diagnosis or not. And I want to acknowledge that not everyone is comfortable with this term and doesn't always find it useful. But for me, it's a useful way to distinguish between the groups, people who are in this group and people who are out of it. Now, I'd like to talk about why neurodiversity is a good thing. There are big benefits to all forms of diversity in an organization, particularly in knowledge-led fields. It's one of the really key evidence-based positive benefits around innovation in particular. Part of that's down to having a wide range of perspectives, being able to see things from different angles, which means being able to see things others cannot, as much as it means not being able to see things others can. And this has particular value in fields where there is a high value in being able to see the flaws, see the problems in other implementations. So things like testing and InfoSec can be particularly really good places for neurodivergent people. Along with this, neurodivergent people often have different skills and interests. Autism is commonly associated with really high detail focus. ADHD and dyslexia can really come with really great creative problem-solving abilities. And you can also get really unexpected combinations of skills, people who are interested in different things and combine different fields. And these can lead to all sorts of benefits within an organization. Another really big aspect of the advantages that neurodivergent people bring is the ability to work with problems based on their own lived experience, and therefore creating better products on the basis of that. And this isn't just for people who share the condition either, because a lot of these conditions are traits. And that means that a lot of people can experience difficulties in that direction, even if not quite so much. Then they can make things better for everyone who finds that particular thing difficult. And the person with the greatest sensitivity to it often has the greatest understanding and ability to resolve it. And it's really important to say that it's not that one group is better than the other here. This is about the range of diversity of different thinking styles, different ways of being in the world, and the ability to work well with and across all of them. Despite all of these benefits, neurodivergent people are significantly underrepresented in the workforce. For example, the latest ONS survey found that only 27% of autistic people were in any form of work at all. This is actually quite a big improvement on the previous survey 2 years hence, which found that only 21% were. So it is an improving picture, but it's still incredibly low. And another aspect of this is that those jobs are often underemployed. Neurodivergent people can find it very hard to progress in a workplace despite having obvious talent. So why should this be? I'd like to look at a couple of reasons that it can be difficult for neurodivergent people to do well in organizations. The first, and perhaps the biggest one of these, is stigma. In a survey a few years ago, a large professional body found that half of the hiring managers it asked across all sectors expressed serious reservations about hiring a neurodivergent person. And we all know that's business speak for they wouldn't. And that's probably an underestimate because, you know, the expectation is that people are supposed to be open and willing to do this. Now, many people who share their neurodivergent status at work become the target of bullying and harassment. They also become the target of well-meaning but counterproductive support and interventions from managers or from HR. And part of that is rooted in these different stereotypes associated with the condition. You know, you should do this because you're autistic, or you can't do that because you're dyslexic. And these can really hold people back. Another aspect of this is inaccessible tools and processes in the organization. Things designed with certain ways of thinking in mind, certain approaches to the world, and which can't cope with other ways of thinking or being. Very often, these approaches fail to deal with the edge cases, situations where perhaps you're in one category, but not another that's always supposed to go together. Or perhaps you're in two categories that aren't ever supposed to be together in the same person. And that can make dealing with this, for these processes, getting through the bureaucracy, a very large barrier. And all these add up to a range of different systemic barriers to really being able to progress in organizations. There are very often a lack of developmental opportunities suited to specific capabilities. And that doesn't just mean developmental opportunities where people can build up skills that perhaps other people have already. It's very often the case that neurodivergent people have particular strengths that go over and above their other colleagues. And it can be just as hard, if not harder, to find good places to develop those strengths well. Another one of these is a lack of organizational flexibility. We very often expect jobs and skills to bundle together in conventional ways. If you're good at that, then you should be good at this. That very often isn't true for neurodivergent people. They can have particular skills in one area and quite significant weaknesses in another. And so if we don't allow people to focus on their strengths and skills, they can never really progress. And another quite significant aspect of this is that we need very often specific qualifications to progress, and that those qualifications themselves are inaccessible and don't necessarily test the on-the-job skills. They very much test a bunch of skills associated with it. So there's a very, very real need for addressing these, and therefore in measuring the efforts that we make to do so. Without addressing them, organizations can't get full access to all of the benefits that neurodiversity offers. And in order to address them, we really do need to collect data and measure things. And now we've covered those basics, I'd really like to start thinking about the kind of EDI data that we are collecting. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on the kind of data that your organization currently collects, what it shares with others. And I'd like to give you just a minute to do this. If you feel comfortable doing so, please share anything in the chat as well of the kind of data that the organizations you've interacted with collect. And I just wanted to mention the comment I've seen in the chat. I think it'd be really helpful to talk about that afterwards. And I'm very sorry that that sounds a very difficult experience. And yeah. So thank you. So we've got data collected on gender, sexuality, social mobility, and disability, but not specifically neurodiversity. Interesting. And someone who's company, we're encouraged to enter disabilities into our HR system. I'd be very interested to know how clear it is what is done with that data as well. And when you've entered that data, what happens with it and whether that's been explained. But we'll get to that perhaps later in the talk as well. It isn't. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. About to run a survey that will collect data around this. Interesting. Okay. Super. Thank you everyone who shared that. I think we've this picture is yeah, is a really big is a really feels like we've captured quite the range of things. Some people not capturing it, not really asking very much at all. Some people asking a lot, but not a lot of clarity about what is shared. And that point about disclosure, I'll come back to that. You've foreshadowed one of the things I'll be talking about. So thank you very much for that. But before we go into that, I want to dig into the reasons that we do collect EDI data in the first place and the reasons that organizations do this. Now, we can't make really useful decisions about data collection without understanding why we're really doing it. And I think this is where a lot of organizations do fall down. It falls into two main categories. The first one of these is that collecting the data is useful for monitoring and evaluating our efforts, how well we're doing as an organization, and using them to improve the processes. So that can involve like management information and informatics. And it can also be used for evaluating interventions. And I've seen it increasingly used for identifying problem areas where there might be an issue with a particular process where people are dropping out. And if there is a specific barrier that needs to be addressed there. It really is key to efforts to improving EDI performance to measure this kind of stuff in all sorts of ways. The next big area of this is collecting data for reporting in order to demonstrate that the organization is doing this well. And this can be both to internal stakeholders and to external ones. And the external stakeholders in particular can pose a really quite large risk for this. And this is one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on. Now, the reasons that external stakeholders might be interested is quite useful for understanding what and why we would share with them. The first big one of these is legal obligations. Now, there are many industries there where you actually, and many territories where you have an obligation to report some of this data at least. So you would legally be required to collect and report on diversity data. Another big area of this is investors. There is a really big rise of activist investing and ethical investment funds. And so the environmental and social governance requirements for investing are under increasing scrutiny. And that's particularly true for large institutional investors like pension funds, who have a lot of requirements about who they invest in. Another big area of this is customers. And this is true both for consumer business and those that deal with businesses. where a lot of organizations are increasingly paying attention to the ESG of their supply chain to make sure that their whole process is doing things in the way that they would like. And the last group of external stakeholders is potential employees. And when there is so much competition for access to and retainment of talent, particularly in IT, this is an increasingly large issue. So at first glance, collecting and reporting on this data is probably fairly straightforward. I think it's this thing around, it's like, okay, you just ask people and then you tell people. But there are some categories, in particular, neurodiversity included, where this really isn't quite as straightforward. And when most people think of EDI, they think of improvements to get more women and more Black people represented in the profession. And indeed, gender and race are by far the two most likely aspects of EDI to be reported on by FTSE 100 companies. Pretty much all of them do report on this in some way or another, and only a very small minority, last time I checked it was in the single digits, reported on anything else. And these areas are really valid and important. And it's a big part of the process of getting more people into the profession and improving the diversity. But there are some minorities where, unlike in these two examples, belonging to that group is not so obvious to outsiders. And I say not obvious to outsiders rather than hidden, because for many of us, when we are in this group, it is pretty obvious that someone else is in that category. We just have to talk with them and interact them. We know the signs, but other people can't always read that. Now, I have a good sense when I'm talking to someone else who's autistic and ADHD. It's pretty straightforward, but not everyone else is. And I expect if you're in one or more of these groups, then you have a good idea about this too. And I really want to say here that it's important to note that this is intersectional. It's very possible to be in more than one category, to have multiple categories and overlapping identities that all interact with each other in really complex ways. And it's also the case that none of the categories are really quite as obvious and clear-cut as the reporting often assumes. Now, much of the data in these categories is special category data under the GDPR, and therefore which requires a greater degree of care in collection and processing. These include racial and ethnic origin, religious and philosophical beliefs, data concerning health, data concerning sexual orientation. And these overlap really considerably with the protected characteristics under the UK Equalities Act, which are those legally protected from discrimination. And those are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. So you can see that there's a particular challenge here. The very data we need for good EDI metrics and to know that we're doing this well is exactly the data that requires the greatest care. Furthermore, because of the stigma and discrimination associated with many of these groups, a lot of people don't choose to share that status with their employer at all. And I've noticed that in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's very much the case that a lot of people don't actually want to share this. People can hide this for their entire career. And this is sometimes called masking, camouflaging, passing, or code switching, depending on which group you belong to and which aspect you want to make sure that people don't notice. It is exhausting and limiting, and one of the really big barriers to minorities participating fully. However, it's often done with good reason. Many people will have had negative past experiences of sharing these things. They will know that in sharing, they put themselves at risk of discrimination, of bullying and harassment in the workplace. And some of these identities can also be associated with really serious harm and threats of physical harm, particularly for LGBTQ people. So when we're talking about data, it's easy to think of it as this kind of abstract thing. But when we're talking about EDI data, it is necessarily really personal. Now, one of the challenges that marginalized groups face is those of us who are not part of these groups don't always understand the risks and the difficulties involved in being in these groups because it's not part of their day-to-day lived experience. It's very easy for people to expect you to share this information without understanding the consequences that you may face. Now, if you're not in any of these categories, if you're not neurodivergent, LGBTQ+, or have any other kind of hidden, in inverted commas, status, I'd like you to pick a group that you might be and imagine that you are. How would you respond to a request like this? And just sit with that for a second. How would you respond? Do you think you would share it with your current employer? How would you feel about it? And whether you have real life experience or not, I'd be really interested to hear what would make you feel safer to share that data. What would you need to feel confident that you can do that? And I'll give you a minute or two to think about this. And if you would like to and feel comfortable doing so, please share any of your thoughts, answers in the chat, bearing in mind that this is a public space. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, this I think this idea of being screened, yeah, people being there being inconsistent support across the organization. Yeah. People fear it will be used against them. Would need to have clear guidance. Thank you for foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about again. Yeah, and senior leadership being open about their own conditions. That's a really good one, and one I often talk about actually as a way of breaking down stigma. I think that's a really effective thing. Yeah. And I think, yeah, there's things changes with age and context. And I've only really started sharing this stuff freely when I started working explicitly in this field. So even for me, it's not something that for the majority of my career, I would have certainly shared up front, and would have been very careful about. So yeah, thank you all for sharing that. Yeah, really interesting points. And now I'd like to talk about some ways that we can do this better, and some of which you've already mentioned. The big one here, as is already mentioned, is transparency about the data that's being collected and what's being done with it. I think to this SG in particular, this shouldn't really be news that organizations have a duty to do this. But I found that they're very often much better at customer privacy than employee privacy. When we looked at the GDPR, I remember having an awful lot of conversations about customers and service users and very few conversations about employees. Many organizations still lack a privacy notice for employees, yet employees are the employee data is some of the most sensitive that pretty much the majority of organizations will handle. And as with any special category data in particular, being really clear about what you collect, why you collect it, and minimizing the collection that you need, making sure that you only collect what you need for those ends is absolutely the way to proceed. Another big way to approach this is self-determination, letting people make up their own mind about the way that the data that they disclose, the way they do that, when and to whom, making it really clear that it's optional to share this data if you do ask for it. And there won't be any negative consequences for not doing so. It's individuals who understand their own personal risk landscape better than anyone else, and trying to mandate that people share information is likely to have a very counterproductive effect, both on the information shared and the presence of and the diversity of the organization itself. And there is a particular area of increased risk that is worth paying attention to here, and that's of inferential rather than direct disclosure. And we usually think about disclosure as explicit. A data breach is about that data being in a database and it having that person's name and that status right next to them, or directly publishing something that we shouldn't. But the organization has the same duty of care to prevent implicit disclosure too. That is, of all of the data that you share, can it be combined with other data that you shared or other data that's freely available in the public domain? in order to infer that someone has a particular minority status. And this is an increasing challenge when so much is published online. Data can be gleaned in all sorts of ways, from photos, from all sorts of things. And the big risk here is, as we get more granular in our reporting, it can become really quite obvious and easy to see why inferential data is a risk. If you've got a 1,000-person company and you're talking about percentages within that, the chances of identifying an individual are relatively low. If you're talking about a 5-person team, then the risk of identifying specific status of an individual is much, much higher. Another big area of this is privileged knowledge, and who has access to knowledge as a part of their day-to-day role. Managers might need some degree of information about this. Human resources people might need some degree of information relating to these statuses. And it's very easy for those to be disclosed accidentally and to share those if people aren't well trained and don't know what they're doing with this data. And another aspect of this is, are they using this data and information appropriately? If people are using it as the basis of discrimination, that's actually not good data governance. They should know what to do with the data, and they should know not to discriminate. It's also worth noting that some people may be out to some of their colleagues, may have declared some status to some of their colleagues, but that's not widely and publicly available. So if we make the assumption that we know in general about something because someone shared it at work, that's not actually a safe thing to share any further. Another aspect of improving this is making sure that you've got plans for harm mitigation in the case of disclosure. This goes beyond a moral duty. Organizations under the GDPR are responsible for covering the costs to the individual of a disclosure of a data breach. And this includes disclosing employee data. So making sure that everyone knows what to do, that there are clear pathways, and making sure that you've understood the risks and mitigated them in advance is a really helpful way of addressing this. And another way that we can do this is using external standards and auditing. Using external standards and external auditors can be a really good way to create trust, particularly with these third parties, when we don't have to share the data directly. Because if we're not sharing that data directly, we're not putting the risks out there of accidental disclosure. And you might think, having heard all this, that it's better not to measure this at all, but that would actually be worse too. It's really vital that everyone's included. Ignoring these groups because they're harder, focusing more on the obvious ones, actually has a really negative effect on the diversity and the representation of these groups in an organization. And there is one other area that is really important to focus on here. Regular reporting is nice and orderly and planned. We can talk about it and say, okay, we've got this strategy. But spontaneous requests often bypass these formal channels, the established procedures. They attract less scrutiny, and they might not really pass the people that really know about this. And as such, they can be a really, really big risk. One big category of this is public requests, so FOI requests, random members of the public, people who are just interested in what's going on in the organization for whatever reasons. And these can be worthwhile to respond to for a number of reasons. They're not necessarily things you want to turn down. You want to maintain positive customer relations with your customer base. You want positive press coverage. You don't want to be seen as an organization that's got something to hide. And if we're talking about freedom of information requests, there might also be a legal obligation to do that, or a legal duty. But it should be noted that employee privacy takes precedence over freedom of information. So if people don't know that, there's a risk of disclosure there. And these can often happen with very short timescales. There are fixed timescales to freedom of information requests. And if a journalist contacts you, there might be publishing deadlines. So they might not allow for the normal channels. So there can be a risk here. Another really big area of this is contractual and private requests. So they're not the general public, but As we mentioned before, customers and clients are often very interested in the EDI performance of the organization. However, these pose a particular risk when there are strong commercial incentives to disclosure. How careful are staff going to be with people's privacy and private data when there's a deal at stake, when they feel like they might lose the deal if they don't share that data? So we really need to respond to these with quite significant care. One of the biggest ways to do that is to actually preempt them. It's one of the big reasons to improve the reporting that we do. Where the question is already answered, we can just redirect people to that. We don't have to come up with something on the fly. And sometimes we can do that by clarifying the intent when there's a request for specific data, and making sure that we can direct people to the thing that's most helpful to them, that does answer their question without revealing data. Another area to consider is what could be maliciously used. Even if there isn't a suspicion of malice on behalf of the person asking, once it's out of the organization, it could go anywhere, and there is real risk associated with this. So we really need to understand that this data could be used maliciously, either against the individual or the organization as a whole. A big way to address this is train staff on the ways to get a good answer and on the limits of disclosure. Anyone who might have contact with anyone, they need to know how to be able to share this data safely and well. We can also offer more context and industry benchmarking to give the data that we do share greater value, and perhaps think about other ways of demonstrating our commitment to EDI as an organization without sharing any data at all, which can be case studies or all sorts of different things. So it's vital to respond to these ad hoc requests with care, and it's easier to be careful using existing material than it is to come up with something at the point of the request. Now, the collection and publishing of all of this data, it's part of a broader picture, one of really establishing the organization as a positive, trustworthy entity that's making sincere efforts to improve and grow its EDI performance. We can't separate data governance from wider environmental, social governance. The damage from getting this wrong, from data breaches, particularly of special category data about employees, is likely to far outweigh any of the benefits of having reported and shared this in the first place. It's also going to make employees much less likely to share that data in the first place. And this can get even more complicated when you're operating internationally across multiple territories. As things stand, there are really significant differences, even contradictions, between different countries and their requirements around this kind of thing, around EDI data. For example, in Malmö, Sweden, you're legally obliged to collect and report on diversity data. If you take the 30-minute journey across the Øresund Bridge to Copenhagen, collecting that data is actually illegal. You're not allowed to even ask. So it's really, really difficult to come up with a single coherent best practice recommendation that works across all territories and all organizations. And this is even further complicated by the fact that risks for different groups and different disclosure varies by location. So, for example, accidentally disclosing someone's LGBTQ+ status can have very different consequences depending on where they are. Potentially, in thinking about, say, a large country like the US, potentially different consequences even within the same country. And the value of publishing this data also varies between organizations and the customer and stakeholder groups they want to engage with and what they're trying to do. And that also needs to inform why this data is collected. Nothing is without risk, and we need to be clear why we're doing this and what's going on, what use are we putting it to. So understand the operating context, the strategic drivers for the EDI work being done, how it relates to the broader strategy of the organization, and therefore what data we are collecting, is vital in keeping both the organization and its employees safe, while still allowing us to grow and improve. There's one core principle I suggest which guides all of this. The goal here is to establish a virtuous cycle in which increased trust between parties means that more data can be shared. By focusing on this, it means that we don't necessarily, there's a lot of technical data involved in this and technical decision making, and that can blind us to the really core thing. And demonstrating our good information governance allows employees in minority groups to share with confidence. That allows others to trust the organization more too. As we've seen, these external stakeholders, the more we can share, the more they can trust us. So by handling employee data well, particularly that relating to the minority status, the organization gives the message that it is a safer place for those in marginalized groups, which improves its EDI and its reputation. So this allows the organization to improve by the careful sharing of such data, and particularly with those outside of the organization, and the careful use of that data within the organization, with all of the benefits, including more diverse employees that the reputation brings. Thank you. Now, that's the end of this area of the talk. Before we move over to questions, I'd just like to talk very briefly about neurodiverse IT and share that with you in case this is new. So neurodiverse IT is as Juliet mentioned, is a new group within BCS for neurodivergent IT professionals, and it's run by neurodiverse IT professionals. Our goals as a group are really to improve the access that the industry has to neurodiverse talent, to support us as neurodivergent IT professionals within our work and within the profession, and to raise awareness of the contribution to IT and therefore to broader society that neurodiversity and neurodivergent people make. We're working with Central BCS this year on addressing the IT skills gap by making the profession more accessible. And we run online and in-person events on a variety of topics, often collaborating with other branches and other SGs like this one. Our next event, perhaps very appropriately, though unintentionally, is about the personal considerations about sharing your neurodivergent status at work and the dimensions you might want to consider when you do and how you might want to go about that. So we welcome everyone with an interest in this, but particularly those who have diagnosis of specific conditions, those who identify with the conditions, and or being neurodivergent in general, and anyone with a personal and professional interest in neurodiversity as a topic. So thank you very much for listening. I really hope you found this useful. You can find out more about me, including a direct link to the Neurodiverse IT page and other ways to get in touch with me on the link here at matthewbellringer.com/links. And I'd always welcome further questions and feedback by email too, which you can get at matthew@matthewbellringer.com. If you do reach out in any way through any channels, I'd be really grateful in knowing that it was this particular talk that was the reason that you reached out.